A millionaire CEO was moments from signing a major deal, until a janitor's 7-year-old daughter burst in and said, "They're lying to you." The office was unusually quiet that evening as Robert Miller, CEO of one of the largest international corporations in the country, stepped out of the elevator and into the private executive wing. The air was still heavy with the weight of his last meeting, a grueling 6-hour negotiation with a group of Chinese investors who had flown in from Shanghai to close a deal worth hundreds of millions. Robert, dressed in his signature deep blue tailored suit, looked every bit the confident businessman he was known to be. His sharp brown hair was combed back neatly, and his light blue eyes, though calm on the surface, showed a flicker of fatigue. He loosened his tie slightly, already running through the details of the deal in his mind, ready to review the translated contract and confirm everything before signing off. But the moment he pushed open the heavy door to his office, he froze in the doorway. Sitting calmly in his leather chair behind his massive desk was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 7. Her brown hair was pulled back with uneven clips, her big brown eyes focused intently on a stack of papers spread out in front of her. She wore a white blouse under a red sleeveless vest and a denim skirt that barely reached her knees. Her small hands were holding a printed contract, his contract, with a red pen resting between her fingers. At first, he thought he was hallucinating from exhaustion, but then she looked up at him with the seriousness of someone far beyond her years and said, "They're tricking you." Robert was momentarily too stunned to speak. He had seen this girl before, once or twice in passing, always clinging quietly to the edge of the hallway while her mother, one of the overnight janitors, cleaned the offices. She never spoke, never made a sound. And now she was sitting at his desk, speaking to him like she belonged there, warning him about a deal that had taken months of effort. "Excuse me," he said finally, stepping further into the room, half in disbelief and half already annoyed. He didn't raise his voice, but the sharpness in his tone was clear. "What are you doing here, and how did you get those documents?" The girl blinked once, unfazed by his authority or the tension in the room. "I was waiting for my mom. She told me to sit quietly and read something, so I picked these. I know Chinese. I read through it. Some of the sentences are different than the ones you were probably told. They changed the meaning." Robert's heart skipped a beat, not because he believed her, but because the confidence in her voice made it impossible to dismiss her outright. "You speak Chinese?" he asked, incredulous. She nodded. "My mom taught me. She used to be a legal translator. Before she got sick and lost her job." Her words were simple but filled with quiet truth. There was no performance, no drama. She was just telling him what she knew. Robert slowly approached the desk and picked up the contract. Red marks were neatly written in the margins, and next to some of the paragraphs were brief English translations written in surprisingly legible handwriting for a child. He didn't want to believe it. He couldn't. This deal was too important, and too many people had reviewed it. Still, something in his gut told him not to ignore her. Without a word, he reached for his phone and called a professional interpreter who worked independently from the company's staff. Within 40 minutes, the interpreter arrived and began reviewing the marked-up pages next to the original Chinese version. As she scanned through the lines, her expression began to shift. Page after page, she confirmed it. The translation provided by the foreign investors had omitted key phrases, altered legal terms, and in some cases, inserted misleading language that would have quietly shifted full ownership of one of Robert's subsidiaries to the foreign firm within 12 months. Robert stood in silence, staring down at the documents as if they were written in fire. Had he signed the deal as planned tomorrow morning, he would have walked into one of the most costly betrayals of his entire career. And no one on his staff, not the legal team, not the consultants, not even his board, had caught it. Only this girl had. And she had been sitting at his desk like it was the most normal thing in the world. The following morning, Robert arrived at the office earlier than usual, his mind still racing from the events of the night before. Sleep had barely touched him, not because of stress over the almost signed contract, but because of what it revealed, how close he had come to losing everything, and how the only person who had truly protected him wasn't on his payroll or holding a prestigious degree. She was a quiet 7-year-old girl whose name he didn't even know until now. Lily. He repeated it silently as he rode the elevator up to the executive floor, trying to make sense of the moment that had cracked open a truth he had long ignored. When the doors opened, the hall was quiet except for the distant sound of vacuuming. Robert walked past the usual staff entrances and made his way to the janitorial supply room. He had never stepped foot there before. It felt strange, almost inappropriate, as if he was crossing some invisible class line. But he pushed through that discomfort, knocked gently, and waited. The door opened slowly, and Martha, the night shift janitor, stood there in her work uniform, holding a mop and visibly startled to see the CEO himself standing in front of her. "Mr. Miller?" she asked, confused and instinctively stepping aside. "May I come in for a moment?" he asked, his tone softer than usual. She hesitated but nodded, setting the mop aside. The small break room was modest: metal lockers, a coffee machine, 2 old chairs. Lily sat at a tiny table in the corner, reading a thick book in simplified Chinese. She looked up and offered a polite nod, as if seeing him here was completely normal. Robert turned to Martha. "Your daughter, she translated the contract I was supposed to sign yesterday," he said quietly. "She saved us from being defrauded." Martha's eyes widened in disbelief. She looked at Lily, then back at Robert, unsure whether she should apologize or be proud. "I'm sorry," she began, "I didn't know she took your papers." "She's usually very respectful." "She didn't take them," Robert interrupted gently. "She studied them. She understood them. And she was right." Martha's face changed. Pride and fear battled behind her expression. "She reads Chinese fluently. I used to teach her every night before bed, back when I was working as a translator. I thought maybe someday she'd get opportunities one never had." Robert sat down in one of the chairs. It was the first time in years he'd sat at eye level with an employee who wasn't an executive, and it felt humbling. "Why are you here, working as a janitor, if you were a translator?" Martha sighed, glancing at her daughter. "I was diagnosed with a neurological condition 3 years ago. It caused tremors in my hands, and I couldn't type or write with precision anymore. I lost my job. Medical bills piled up. We lost our home. The only work I could find that would take me without paperwork, references, or recent experience, was cleaning. I took it. I had no choice." Robert was silent for a long moment. He didn't know how to respond. He had built a world where people were hired for performance, credentials, and efficiency. But here was a woman with more integrity and skill than half his board, scrubbing floors at night because no one had taken the time to ask her story. And here was her daughter, who might be one of the brightest minds he had ever encountered, sitting unnoticed in corners while the company nearly walked into a financial trap. He finally spoke. "I'd like to offer you a position in our legal team. It doesn't require typing, just advising, reviewing contracts, identifying inconsistencies. You'll have access to a voice-to-text system, and we can adjust the tools to match your abilities." Martha's eyes filled with tears. "I haven't worked in an office in years." "You never stopped being qualified," he said. "You just stopped being seen." Lily smiled softly, still silent, still somehow more composed than either adult in the room. "And Lily," Robert added, turning to her, "would you consider coming in once a week to meet with me? I'd like to give you some logic puzzles, language challenges. Just for fun. We'll call it an experiment." Lily nodded. "Will I get books in Chinese?" Robert chuckled. "You'll get a whole shelf." As he left the room, Robert felt the shift inside himself settle into something permanent. He realized how much potential was being lost every day simply because of where people sat, what uniforms they wore, and which voices society had decided not to listen to. And he promised himself that this would not be the end of the story. It was just the beginning. The next few weeks passed in a way that felt both surreal and grounding for Robert. True to his word, he arranged for Martha to meet with the legal department, and though her return to corporate life was cautious at first, it was immediately clear to everyone in the room that she didn't just belong there, she raised the bar. With the help of assistive technology and a calm yet focused presence, she reviewed contracts with sharp intuition, offering observations others had missed entirely. She was never showy about her knowledge. Instead, she listened closely, spoke only when she had something meaningful to add, and earned the quiet respect of even the most skeptical attorneys. What no one in the company had expected, however, was how fast word began to spread. Employees started whispering about the janitor's daughter who saved the CEO. Some dismissed it as rumor, others asked if it really happened, and some were inspired to speak up about things they'd stayed quiet about for too long. It was as if Lily had broken some invisible wall, one that separated those with titles from those with talent. And while no official announcement had been made, Robert didn't mind the murmurs. In fact, for the first time, he welcomed transparency. Lily began visiting Robert's office every Friday after school. He cleared a corner of the room and installed a low bookshelf filled with Chinese folktales, puzzle books, translation dictionaries, and even novels in simplified Mandarin. She approached each session with the same seriousness and quiet focus as an adult twice her age. Robert would give her logic games, word riddles, or idiomatic puzzles, and they would solve them together. What surprised him most wasn't just how fast she learned, it was how much he looked forward to these moments. It had been years since he'd engaged with someone without an agenda, without pressure, without needing to be anyone other than himself. One afternoon, after they finished translating a Tang Dynasty poem together, Robert leaned back in his chair and looked at her. "What do you want to be when you grow up?" Lily didn't answer right away. She looked out the tall office window, watching cars move like ants through the city below. "I used to want to be a teacher," she said. "But now I think I want to be someone who helps people see the truth. Maybe a judge. Or maybe someone who makes rules more fair." He smiled. "You already do that." Her eyes met his. "Only if someone listens." That night, Robert sat alone in his office long after everyone else had gone home. He thought about what she had said and realized just how deeply it echoed the things he'd once believed in, before profit and pressure had buried those ideals. He had built an empire that was admired from the outside, but it had taken a child to remind him what mattered on the inside: honesty, fairness, and seeing people for who they really are. Determined to act, he started drafting a new company policy, a mentorship initiative open to employees and their children, not based on resume or background, but on potential. He wanted to give others the chance to be seen as Lily had been. The idea wasn't met with immediate enthusiasm by the board. Several executives questioned the need to distract the company with social projects. But Robert, once patient and passive in meetings, now spoke with conviction. "This is not charity," he said during one board meeting. "This is long-term investment in untapped intelligence. If we can find one Lily, there are others. What kind of company are we, if we only measure value in numbers and overlook the minds working beside us in silence?" There was a long pause in the room. Then, slowly, one by one, the board members nodded. As plans for the mentorship program began to take shape, Lily continued to attend her sessions. She asked tougher questions, brought her own ideas, and even suggested a few edits to Robert's draft policy, one of which he ended up keeping word for word. When he asked how she'd known to phrase it that way, she replied with a shrug, "It just sounded more kind." By the end of the month, Martha had transitioned to a full-time strategic advisor role, with benefits and flexibility for her health needs. Her presence in the company became a quiet beacon for others who had felt unseen. People from every department, maintenance, tech, customer service, began volunteering to mentor or be mentored. Something was shifting, and Robert could feel it deep in the rhythm of the building. The company wasn't just recovering from a near-miss scandal, it was transforming. And it had started with a little girl who had never been invited to speak, but spoke anyway. And someone who had finally decided to listen. The office atmosphere had shifted so subtly over the next several weeks that many didn't notice at first. It was in the way people lingered a little longer in the halls to speak with someone they once only passed in silence, or the way ideas began to flow from all levels of staff rather than just the upper floors. Robert had begun to see something emerge, a culture that was slowly unlearning its rigid hierarchy and starting to function like a living, breathing organism, rather than a cold machine. And at the heart of it, though few truly realized it, was Lily. Lily's weekly visits to Robert's office continued without interruption. Each time, she arrived carrying a worn notebook, her handwriting neat and compact, filled with questions she had written down over the course of the week, some about Chinese idioms, others about ethics, and even one that asked, if a company makes a lot of money but forgets people, does it still win? Robert never rushed her questions. He treated each one as if it came from a board member. Slowly, his entire mindset was evolving, shaped by the pure, sincere curiosity of a child with no agenda. One afternoon, while reviewing some minor partnership contracts, Lily noticed a clause that seemed vague. She asked if vagueness in language could be used to exploit people. Robert, intrigued by the question, explained that yes, in business, ambiguity was sometimes used intentionally to maintain leverage. Lily frowned. So if someone doesn't understand the words, they might agree to something bad without knowing? He nodded. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "That's not fair. I think words should be clear like windows, not foggy like mirrors." Those words stayed with Robert for days. He found himself repeating them during a conference call with a legal team and again during a shareholder meeting. "Clear like windows, not foggy like mirrors," he said. And each time he said it, something shifted in the room. People began to nod. And more than that, they began to reflect. Meanwhile, Martha had fully settled into her new role. She had her own modest but well-equipped office now, though she still cleaned up after herself as if afraid to take up too much space. Robert noticed this and gently encouraged her to own her success. "You belong here just as much as anyone," he told her. "You didn't get lucky, you were simply finally seen." One particular Friday, Robert asked Lily if she wanted to sit in on a team meeting where his department heads were reviewing company-wide policies. "Only if I can ask a question," she said. He laughed and agreed. During the meeting, the executives discussed metrics, projected growth, and internal restructuring. When Robert gave Lily the floor, she looked around the room filled with adults in suits and asked, "If a company is getting bigger but the people feel smaller, is that still good?" The room went completely silent. No one knew what to say at first, because the question hit a nerve. One of the managers finally spoke up, admitting that her team had been struggling with burnout and didn't feel heard. Another added that junior employees often had ideas but feared speaking up. For the first time, what was meant to be a strategy meeting turned into a conversation about culture, inclusion, and trust. Not one chart or graph was shown after that. Instead, stories were told, and by the end, real changes were proposed, from anonymous suggestion channels to rotating mentorship lunches. After the meeting, Robert walked Lily back to his office and handed her a soft-covered book, A Beginner's Guide to Business Ethics. "Not because I want you to work here someday," he said. "But because you already understand it better than most people I know." She smiled, hugging the book tightly. The company newsletter ran a quiet story the next week titled, "The Littlest Advisor," with a photo of Lily helping Robert sort through translated documents. It didn't mention her name, respecting her privacy, but the impact was immediate. Employees began sharing stories about moments when they, too, had been overlooked or had seen someone else with potential go unnoticed. And with every story shared, the company grew, not in profit, but in soul. Robert began receiving letters from employees' children, drawings, thank you notes, even suggestions. One child recommended installing reading corners in the break rooms. Another asked if grown-ups could have feelings days too, like mental health ones. Instead of filing them away, Robert brought them into meetings. If we can listen to a 7-year-old who saved us from a disaster, he told his team, then we can certainly listen to the next generation of voices too. Lily didn't realize the full extent of what she had set in motion. To her, she was just helping a man who had listened when others hadn't. But to Robert, and to everyone who had begun to awaken to a more human way of working, she had become the quiet catalyst for a company's rebirth. The following months brought a kind of growth that Robert had never anticipated, not the kind measured in quarterly reports or shareholder dividends, but the kind that changed how people walked into work in the morning. The transformation of the company's culture, inspired by Lily's quiet brilliance and Martha's long overdue recognition, continued to ripple outward through departments that had long functioned in isolation. What was once a place of calculated silence and efficient routine had slowly begun to breathe with something else: connection. Robert made it a priority to visit every floor, often without notice, simply to talk to employees, not to check up on them, but to ask how they were doing, what they needed, and what they noticed. At first, people were nervous, unsure if this was a new management tactic or a short-lived PR strategy. But Robert's tone was different. His questions were real. He remembered names. He followed up. He even sat with interns in the cafeteria, asking them what they would change if they could rewrite the employee handbook. Word spread quickly: the CEO wasn't just open door, he was on the floor. During one of Lily's weekly visits, Robert asked if she wanted to come with him to a leadership team workshop being held that weekend in the countryside. It was an informal off-site event designed to brainstorm new ways to lead with purpose. He expected her to say no, assuming it would be too boring or too adult. But she agreed, on one condition: can I bring a question? On Saturday morning, she walked into the retreat's main hall wearing a sky-blue dress and a small backpack. She sat quietly through 2 hours of discussion until Robert gave her a moment to speak. She stood up, cleared her throat, and said, "If a leader never asks for help, is he really leading? Or is he just walking alone and hoping people follow?" The room went silent, not because the question was confrontational, but because it was uncomfortably true. One of the senior executives, a man known for never delegating or admitting weakness, quietly said, "I think I've been walking alone for years." Another added that leadership had become so tangled in pride that vulnerability was seen as weakness instead of wisdom. The conversation turned vulnerable in a way Robert had never seen. What was meant to be a strategic planning session became a series of honest stories, including failures and fears, shared without defensiveness. No one took notes. But everyone walked away changed. Later that evening, Robert found Lily sitting by the retreat center's small pond, tossing pebbles into the water. He sat beside her and asked, "Where do your questions come from?" She didn't look at him. Instead, she watched the ripples stretch across the surface. "I just wonder about things people don't say out loud. Sometimes those are the most important ones." Robert felt a deep admiration for her. He realized that she wasn't just gifted, she was fearless in her own quiet way. She didn't need to shout to change a room. She only needed to ask what others were too afraid to admit. Back at the office the next week, the effects of the retreat began to show. Leaders began holding team lunches without agendas, just to listen. Anonymous feedback tools were implemented and actually reviewed. Promotions began to be based not only on performance but on collaboration and mentorship. Martha, who once cleaned those very conference rooms late at night, now sat at the decision-making table, offering insight that came from lived experience rather than boardroom theory. Employees who had once considered leaving the company began staying. Productivity didn't drop, it improved. Burnout lessened. People took pride in what they were building together. Even the company's public reputation began to shift. Articles were written not about their financial success, but about their unusual approach to leadership, one built around empathy and listening. One afternoon, Robert received a letter from an executive at a rival firm. It read, "I don't know what changed inside your company, but everyone we hire from you says they were treated like people first. Whatever you're doing, it's working." Robert placed the letter in a drawer alongside Lily's first notebook, the one filled with her small handwriting and impossible questions. He opened to the first page where she had written something he'd never noticed before. In a careful script, she had written, "Sometimes the best way to lead is to listen like a child and care like a parent." He sat in silence, realizing that those words were no longer just observations. They had become the new compass for an entire organization. And no matter what came next, he would never forget who had first handed him that compass, or the courage it took for her to do so. By the time the new fiscal year began, the company's transformation had not only reached internal departments, it had started to attract outside attention. What had once been a standard global firm now appeared in business magazines not because of its financial dominance, but because of something far rarer, its emotional intelligence. Journalists wanted to know what had sparked the change. Analysts speculated about a hidden leadership consultant. But those inside the company knew better. It hadn't started with a strategy memo or a leadership seminar. It had started with a child and her honest voice. Robert, now more open to perspectives he once overlooked, decided to make that voice part of something lasting. He brought a small group of people together, legal experts, educators, community organizers, and a few employees from different departments, and proposed the creation of an internal academy. It wouldn't be a school in the traditional sense, but a mentorship and development hub for employee families and local students with extraordinary potential but limited access. He called it Project Window, named after something Lily once said, that words should be clear like windows, not foggy like mirrors. At first, the idea seemed too ambitious. Executives questioned whether it was the company's role to be involved in educational programming. But Robert reminded them of the moment the company nearly lost everything because no one had noticed a child's brilliance. "We were saved not by a consultant," he said during one board meeting, "but by a girl reading quietly in the back of a room. Imagine how many more are out there." This time, no one argued. Lily, though still a child, became the silent symbol of the new initiative. Her story was never officially broadcast, but those who worked on the project knew it by heart. She continued her visits to Robert's office, though now their sessions had expanded into discussions on ethics, language, logic puzzles, and sometimes even art. One afternoon, she brought in a watercolor painting of a window with light streaming through it and gave it to Robert without a word. He hung it in his office immediately. Beneath the image, she had written, "Light belongs to everyone." Meanwhile, Martha had begun to design parts of the Project Window curriculum, focused on communication, trust building, and how to read contracts with both legal accuracy and human compassion. Her background gave her a unique ability to bridge high-level legal knowledge with the real-life experiences of families and workers. Her health, once fragile and uncertain, had stabilized. She now walked with purpose through the same halls she once cleaned, often stopping to chat with employees who used to avoid eye contact with her. Her presence was no longer a reminder of struggle, but a symbol of what recovery and respect could create. Project Window launched its pilot program with a small group of children. Some were children of custodial staff, cafeteria workers, and security guards. Others came from nearby public schools. They gathered once a week in a reconfigured floor of the company's building, transformed into an open, bright learning space filled with books, language materials, and collaborative tools. Instead of a traditional classroom setup, children sat in circles, discussed real-world problems, and were guided by employees who volunteered as mentors. Robert made it a point to teach a session once a month. During his first visit, he told the group, "You don't have to grow up fast to be heard. Sometimes the smallest voice knows the biggest truth." Lily attended the first few sessions quietly. Though she had inspired the entire project, she didn't see herself as special. In fact, she often stepped back to let other kids speak first, encouraging them with her eyes. One boy named Javier, whose father worked in maintenance, struggled to read aloud because of a speech delay. During one session, he froze in front of the group, embarrassed and on the verge of tears. Without a word, Lily slid her chair next to his and gently whispered, "Go slow. I'll read with you." They read the paragraph together, syllable by syllable, and when they finished, the room erupted in applause, not because the reading was perfect, but because the moment was. That evening, Robert stood by the window in his office, watching the city lights flicker on. He thought about how differently he used to measure value. Once it was margins, reports, and efficiency. Now it was trust, courage, and the unseen strength of people who had never been invited to speak. He knew there was still work to do, there always would be. But as long as people like Lily kept asking quiet questions, and as long as he kept listening, the company would never lose its way again. The painting she gave him glowed faintly in the reflection of the window. And for the first time in years, Robert felt something he hadn't even realized he'd lost. Not just hope, but belief, in people, in change, and in the kind of future you don't just build, but build better than the one you inherited. The impact of Project Window began to expand beyond anything Robert had initially imagined. What started as a small initiative designed to offer overlooked children access to mentorship had quietly become a movement, one that sparked conversations in other companies, inspired educational institutions, and caught the attention of civic leaders. Local news outlets began running features on the project, not as corporate promotion, but as genuine stories of children discovering their voices and adults rediscovering their responsibility to listen. Invitations came in for Robert to speak at conferences, but he often declined, insisting that the story wasn't his to tell alone. Still, one invitation stood out. It came from the National Youth Futures Forum, an annual gathering of educators, innovators, and child advocates from across the country. They asked if Robert would speak about the intersection of business and youth empowerment. After some hesitation, he agreed, but only if Lily could attend and, if she chose, speak as well. The forum organizers, though surprised, quickly agreed. When they arrived at the event, held in a massive auditorium in Chicago, Lily looked small next to the crowds of professionals and university researchers. But she didn't seem intimidated. She held a small notebook in her hands, and as she and Robert waited backstage, she read it silently to herself, lips moving slightly. Robert watched her with quiet pride, remembering the first time he had seen her sitting in his chair, correcting a 10-page contract with a red pen and the calm assurance of someone who had never been told her voice didn't matter. When it was time to go on stage, Robert opened by sharing the story, not about the company's financial recovery, but about how one moment of unexpected honesty had forced him to reimagine what leadership truly meant. He told them about Lily, about her mother, and about the quiet revolution that started in a janitor's break room. Then he introduced Lily, unsure if she would say anything or simply wave. But she stood up, walked to the microphone, and began to speak with a voice that, though soft, carried into every corner of the hall. She didn't talk about contracts or translation or business at all. Instead, she told a story. She described a time, years earlier, when she and her mother were living in a shelter. They had one blanket, and every night her mother would pretend not to be cold so Lily could sleep. "I didn't know what sacrifice meant then," she said, "but I knew what love felt like. And now I think that if a company doesn't feel a little like love, then something's missing." She paused, scanning the faces in the audience. Grown-ups always say kids are the future, but we're also the present. We're watching, and we remember who listens. The entire auditorium rose in applause, genuine, prolonged, emotional. Not because her words were rehearsed or polished, but because they were real. Later that evening, as they flew home, Robert asked her if she was nervous up there. She shook her head. "No. I wasn't alone." That moment ignited a new chapter for the company and Project Window. Requests came in from schools and nonprofits to partner, and rather than grow the program into something massive and diluted, Robert decided to make it deeper. He assigned cross-departmental teams to work directly with each student cohort, forming long-term relationships instead of quick lessons. Martha began working with local public schools to identify children who, like Lily once was, had no platform for their abilities to be seen. She created a system where every employee could nominate a child, not for talent in math or reading, but for asking good questions. Lily continued to visit Robert's office, though now their conversations drifted into philosophy, history, and ethics. She once asked, "Do you think grown-ups stop being brave, or do they just forget they were ever scared?" Robert admitted he didn't know, but promised he would keep trying to be brave anyway. Their bond had become something much greater than mentor and student. It was trust, built from honesty, and nurtured by a shared vision of what the world could be if people stopped underestimating kindness. One day, Lily brought a new drawing. This time it wasn't a window. It was a staircase, uneven, hand-drawn, climbing upward into a soft blue sky. At the bottom, in small letters, she'd written, "Everyone should get to rise. Especially the ones no one lifts." Robert framed it without a word. That year, employee retention hit an all-time high. Internal promotions increased by over 30%, and the company was recognized not just for innovation, but for integrity. But for Robert, the real success wasn't measured in numbers anymore. It was in the email from an employee who said their child had learned to read because of Project Window. It was in the janitor who now taught weekend language workshops. It was in Lily, who kept asking better and better questions, and kept reminding everyone that the smallest voices often speak the greatest truths when someone finally listens. The final weeks of the year arrived wrapped in a kind of quiet wonder that settled over the company like snowfall, subtle, persistent, and transformative. What had started as one child's voice had become an invisible thread running through everything. The way meetings opened with moments of reflection, the way janitors and executives now greeted each other by name, the way silence was no longer interpreted as weakness but as space for someone else to be heard. The offices, once sterile and controlled, now had life in them, drawings pinned to bulletin boards, storyboards from Project Window lining the hallways, and bookshelves filled with donated titles in multiple languages. Employees no longer just came to work. They came to build something. Robert sat alone in his office one evening, a cup of tea warming his hands, and watched the sun disappear behind the skyline. He had learned to listen to moments like this, to sit in the stillness and measure success by more than stock prices. The desk in front of him no longer felt like a wall between worlds but like a bridge. On it were two framed pieces, Lily's staircase drawing and the watercolor window. He reached into a drawer and took out the original contract, the one Lily had marked up in red. He hadn't thrown it away. He couldn't. It reminded him of where it all began, and how close he had come to losing everything by ignoring the people right in front of him. That evening, Martha knocked softly and stepped into the office. She didn't need permission anymore, she knew she belonged. She had just returned from a speaking event at a local university where she had shared her story, her fall, her illness, her daughter's quiet defiance of invisibility, and the company that chose to listen instead of dismiss. She sat across from Robert, her posture more confident than he'd ever seen. "Do you think it will last?" she asked. "All this, kindness?" He thought for a long time before answering. "It will, if we protect it. Culture is like a garden. It doesn't grow on autopilot. It needs care. But now that people know what it can look like, they won't want to go back." A few days later, the company hosted its first annual Voices That Matter gathering, a year-end celebration where anyone from any department could share stories, ideas, or even questions that shaped them that year. The auditorium filled with employees and their families. Laughter echoed in the halls. There were tears, applause, and quiet silences that no one rushed to fill. Lily sat in the front row beside her mother. She was wearing a simple white dress and had her notebook on her lap. Robert opened the ceremony with a short speech, one that surprised no one with its sincerity. But the final moment belonged to Lily. When she walked on stage, the entire room hushed, not out of obligation, but out of recognition. She didn't read from a speech. She didn't present numbers or reports. Instead, she asked one question. What if every person mattered before they proved they did? And then she smiled, gave a small wave, and walked back to her seat. The crowd stood in silence for several seconds before applause erupted, longer and louder than anyone expected. People were not just clapping for her. They were clapping for everything she represented, the overlooked, the unheard, the quietly brilliant, and the deeply kind. That night, as the last guests left and the lights dimmed, Robert walked through the now empty hallway, past framed photographs of moments from the past year. He paused by a picture of Lily helping a boy sound out a word, both their faces lit with joy. He thought of the future, not as something to conquer, but as something to nurture. Outside, the winter air had turned cold, but the building glowed warmly from within. Inside its walls were people who no longer felt invisible. Children who no longer felt voiceless. And a leader who no longer led from above, but from beside. As Robert locked his office for the night, he took one last look at the painting on the wall, the staircase leading upward into sky, and whispered, not to anyone in particular, but to everything that had changed him, "Thank you for showing me what I couldn't see." And quietly, gently, he closed the door, knowing this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. This story is a testament to the quiet power of truth and the underestimated strength of the unheard. What makes the ending so moving isn't just that justice is served or lives are improved, it's that it happens through humility, listening, and the courage to see value where others don't. The journey of a powerful CEO learning from a janitor's daughter shows how leadership is not about authority but about humanity. The fact that real change came from a child's voice reminds us that brilliance and wisdom aren't tied to age, title, or status, they often come from the most unexpected places. The ending doesn't feel like a resolution, it feels like an awakening, both for the characters and for us. And in that way, it becomes more than just a happy ending, it becomes a call to pay attention to those we're trained to overlook.